Good evening. Good evening. If you want to take your seats, we're going to get started. Welcome to our panel, Redeeming Punishment, Catholic Approach to Criminal Justice Reform. I'm Richard Avramanko, Director of the Center for the Study of Liberal Democracy and Professor of Political Science here at the University of Wisconsin. The Center for the Study of Liberal Democracy is a think tank on campus here at the UW that promotes appreciation for and a critical understanding of the cardinal principles and institutions of liberal democracy, including constitutionalism and the rule of law, the meaning and scope of freedom and free markets, and the centrality of individual rights. We're founded in 2006 by Don Downs, who's the guru of the First Amendment here, or he's now retired, and he bequeathed the center to me. But he founded the center back in 2006 in the wake of the faculty speech codes, the effort to institute these faculty speech codes at UW. They won those battles, and then Don retired. And he passed the center on to me. And since I took over the center, we have expanded the center and added various initiatives beyond our original First Amendment agenda, such things as civic and economic literacy, civil military relations, and most recently, Catholic social and political thought. And it's under the rubric of this initiative, Catholic social political thought, that we are hosting the conference over the next couple days. So if you're interested in other events that we do in the center, please look for our website online. It's csld.wis.edu. And you can get on our mailing list. I promise you, maybe one email every other week outlining. And if you get other stuff, I will be surprised and calling cybersecurity. And tonight, I'm honored to introduce the moderator for our panel, the Honorable Thomas Moore Donnelly. Judge Donnelly is a judge of the Circuit Court of Cook County, where he's assigned to the Law Division and hears civil jury trials. He's a faculty member of the National Judicial College and chairs the Illinois Judicial College Board of Trustees, the Illinois Supreme Court's educational arm, which is responsible for the training of Illinois judges and those who assist judges in the court system, including probation officers, court clerks, and trial court administrators and law clerks. Before becoming a judge, he clerked for the Honorable Marianne McMorrow and served as assistant public defender for 13 years. He's taught at Loyola University, Chicago School of Law, the Mandel Legal Aid Clinic at the University of Chicago Law School. He's lectured at Washington and Lee Law School, Marquette Law, DePaul Law, and Judge Donnelly has written articles on a variety of legal topics and has served in leadership roles at Loyola's Hank Center for the Catholic Intellectual Heritage, the Lumen Christi Institute, and the Catholic Lawyers Guild of Chicago. Please give Judge Donnelly a warm Wisconsin welcome. Thank you.
In order for the criminal judicial function not to become cynical and impersonal mechanism, we need people who are balanced, prepared, but above all, passionate about justice, aware of the serious duty and great responsibility they bear. Only in this way will the law, all law, not only criminal law, not be an end in itself, but at the service of the persons involved, whether they be the perpetrators of the crimes or those who have been offended. At the same time, by acting as an instrument of substantive justice and not just formal justice, criminal law will be able to perform the task of real and effective protection of the essential legal goods of the community. And we must head, certainly, towards restorative criminal justice. Pope Francis's words to the International Association of Penal Lawyers in November 2019 challenge us tonight as they did then, and set the stage for tonight's dialogue. Redeeming punishment, Catholic Approaches to Criminal Justice Reform. Special thanks to the Center for the Study of Liberal Democracy for hosting this colloquium of the Lumen Christi Catholic Criminal Justice Reform Network, and to the following people and institutions for making this colloquium possible. The Most Reverend Donald Heying, Reverend Eric Nielsen, St. Paul's Catholic Student Center, Professor Richard Avramenko, University of Wisconsin Law School, and Badger Catholic. We have many co-sponsors, but the list is so long, I'm going to forbear reading it and introduce our speakers. But you can read the list on the website. Kevin A. Carr is Secretary for the Wisconsin Department of Corrections. He previously worked as U.S. Marshal in the Eastern District of Wisconsin and was appointed to that position by President Barack Obama. Previously, he spent 30 years working in the Milwaukee County Sheriff's Office, where he held numerous positions, including sergeant, lieutenant, captain, deputy inspector, and inspector. As inspector, Secretary Carr served as the second in charge of daily operations for the agency. He was instrumental in the creation of the Milwaukee County Criminal Justice Council. Secretary Carr holds a bachelor's degree in criminal justice management and an associate's degree in criminal justice from Concordia University. He has received postgraduate certificates from Harvard University, the FBI National Academy, and Northwestern University. Dean Strang is a distinguished professor in residence at Loyola University Chicago Law School and a practicing criminal defense lawyer. He has written 2 books of legal history, and these are the best titles for books ever. You're supposed to laugh at that. Thank you, Michael. Worse Than the Devil, Anarchists, Clarence Darrow, and Justice in a Time of Terror, Wisconsin University Press, 2013. And even better than that first title, Keep the Wretches in Order, America's Biggest Mass Trial, The Rise of the Justice Department and the Fall of the IWW, University of Wisconsin Press, 2019, along with several law review articles. Before entering academia, Professor Strang created and ran the first office of the Federal Defender Service of Wisconsin and also worked as a private attorney representing defendants in a number of high-profile criminal cases. Father Javier del Castillo is a priest of the Prelature of Opus Dei and currently serves as the vicar of Opus Dei in the Midwest. He was a high school chaplain from 2007 to 2013 at the Heights School, Potomac, Maryland, and Northridge Prep, Niles, Illinois, which is where I first met Father Javier when he was chaplain for my youngest son, and my wife Ann here is in the fishnet, or the, what do you call it, fisherman's sweater. Fishnet is different entirely. And our son Gabriel was there at Northridge, and I've treasured the friendship with him ever since. He holds a bachelor's degree in electrical engineering, Cooper Union, New York, 1998, and a doctorate in philosophy, Pontifical University of the Holy Cross, Rome, 2007. For the last few years, he has given lectures at the Catholic Lawyers Guild of Chicago on topics relating to faith and reason, social doctrine, and religion and law. And recently, he joined me at Notre Dame University in giving a talk on the jurisprudence of human dignity at the at the Ethics and Culture conference this fall. And batting cleanup is our most impressive speaker. Cecelia Klingele is an associate professor at the University of Wisconsin Law School, a faculty associate of the University of Wisconsin's La Follette School of Public Affairs, and the Institute for Research on Poverty. Professor Klingele is fascinated by the challenges of managing human behavior, particularly the behavior of those who operate and are subject to the criminal legal system. Her past work has focused on community corrections, correctional programming interventions, and treatment of violence within the legal system. She has served as an associate reporter for the American Law Institute's Model Penal Code, Sentencing Revision 2012-2018, external co-director of the University of Minnesota's Rabina Institute's Sentencing Law and Policy Program 2013-2018, and as an appointed member of the Policy Advisory Group of the Wisconsin Catholic Conference 2010-2015. Prior to entering academia, Professor Klingele clerked for Chief Judge Barbara B. Crabb of the U.S. District Court for the Western District of Wisconsin, Judge Susan H. Black of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the 11th Circuit, and Justice John Paul Stevens of the U.S. Supreme Court. She is a member of the executive board of the Lumen Christi Institute's Catholic Criminal Justice Reform Network, and she is on the leadership team of the Society of Christian Legal Scholars. Secretary Carr will lead us off. Secretary Carr.
Thank you, Judge Donnelly. Good evening. Thank you all for being here today and asking me to participate in this event. And as you just heard, my name is Kevin Carr, the Secretary of the Department of Corrections. And what you may not know is I'm also Catholic. I attend Mass at Jesu Church on the Marquette University campus daily, and I try to live by the Catholic doctrine and teaching in both my personal and professional life. In December of 2018, after 40 years in law enforcement, I was preparing to retire when I was asked by Governor Evers to join his administration as the Secretary of the Department of Corrections. I accepted this position because I viewed this opportunity as a chance to truly help people change their lives and impact families, our communities, and public safety in a way that was much different from law enforcement. More importantly, I truly believe God accomplishes some of his work through us. And this is what he wanted me to do at this time of my life. At the Department of Corrections, we're working to achieve our mission of public safety by focusing our efforts on key factors proven to help people succeed and become law-abiding citizens. Our criminal justice system is badly in need of reform. Our incarcerations are too high, our incarceration rates are too high, and that comes at a high cost to taxpayers, our communities, the individuals returning from incarceration, and their families, as well as the concept that what we're doing is currently not providing the outcomes we need or desire. Governor Evers and I have been working together over the last 3 years to lower our prison population and provide the resources necessary to help folks have success and get their lives back on track. We have and will continue to do the right thing every chance we get. But when it comes to criminal justice reform in a comprehensive way, there seems to be little interest in the legislature in implementing sustainable, comprehensive criminal justice reform in this state. There are more than 6 million adults in the United States, either incarcerated or on correctional supervision. Nationwide, and in our state specifically, the disproportionate rates of Black and brown people in our prisons is staggering. In Wisconsin alone, we have around 20,000 individuals incarcerated in any one of our 37 facilities, and approximately 63,000 people are on correctional supervision. approximately 9,000 folks are released from prison and return to our communities every year. Our corrections budget is $1.2 billion. Currently, it costs about $44,000 a year to house someone in prison, compared to less than $4,000 a year to put them on community supervision. Our agency has made many efforts towards reform using the administrative avenues available to us, including our Revocation, Reduction, and Response Initiative, which uses national evidence-based practices to better manage those on supervision, interventions to assist individuals in finding employment through creating job centers and training programs, providing more educational opportunities by partnering with colleges, assessing treatment, finding housing, and providing positive support for those individuals in our communities. Despite our best efforts, I believe here in Wisconsin, we just don't have adequate resources to do the things we know are effective and supports those who need help to live crime-free lives. We must do more to ensure that justice is done in a way that leads to increased public safety, recognizes the rights of victims, and holds persons accountable who break the law while reducing incarceration rates and the costs related to imprisonment. I believe we can start by using a Catholic approach that acknowledges the dignity of every human person. This perspective provides a solid foundation for the changes we need in the system. In November of 2000, the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops issued Responsibility, Rehabilitation, and Restoration, a Catholic perspective on crime and criminal justice. This document emphasizes the significance of restitution for victims and further states that from a Catholic perspective, protecting society and rehabilitating those who violate the law are the primary purposes of punishment. I do believe that we can keep our communities safe and restore lives by engaging both victims and those engaged in criminal activity using principles rooted in restorative justice. If incarceration and punishment are virtually the same things, the majority of correction systems in our country seem to prefer punishment over rehabilitation and retribution as opposed to restoration. I believe that this leads to a failure to recognize those who are incarcerated as human beings. The issue of punishment and accountability is very complex, and we could spend hours discussing it without reaching consensus. Since the current system focuses on punishment, then it should be no surprise that it produces and uses terms that dehumanize individuals rather than recognize those who committed crimes as human beings made in God's image. Over the last 3 years, I've made it a priority to use person-first language throughout the Department of Corrections. Person-first language in the correctional setting emphasizes the person, not the person's criminal status. By placing the person first, their criminal status is no longer the primary defining characteristic of the individual, but just one of several aspects of the whole person. Dehumanizing labels such as inmates, criminals, convicts, felons, and offenders stereotype and marginalize people rather than support them while they're trying to rebuild their lives. In our agency, we now use statements such as person in our care instead of inmate, client in place of offender, and youth in place of juveniles. I'm working to lead our agency through my example of fostering communication rooted in respect and hope. If successful, I believe that we can eliminate stereotypes that inhibit a person's ability to succeed. When dehumanizing labels are applied to a person, sometimes they only see themselves as that label, and that may inhibit their successful reentry into society. As Catholics, we know the value and dignity of human life and have an obligation to uphold that value in what we do, including our work. I'm proud to say that without issuing written directives or orders to do so, person-first language has been widely adopted by a large number of our 10,000 employees. Additionally, the Dane County and Milwaukee County Sheriff's Offices both recently adopted person-first language at their agencies. While this may sound like a simple change, applying the same value to all human life and not applying labels to a person can sometimes have its difficulties. For example, showing the same level of respect to the individuals who commit crimes as we do to their victims can understandably be challenging. Some of the individuals in our care have committed really serious offenses and extremely harmful behavior that has lasting impacts on their victims and our communities. It's important that we don't minimize their actions. I believe accountability is an important part of justice, but it's equally as important to remember that people are imprisoned to be separated from society as their punishment, and there's no need for additional punishment after their arrival. Once they're in our care, it's our duty to provide opportunities for change to each person in a fair and equitable manner that I believe is compatible with our faith's view of human dignity, instead of holding preconceived notions and stereotypes about who they are and their abilities or their worth, which ultimately influences how persons are treated in our system and how they see themselves. Person-first language allows us to separate individual behavior from the person and that person's actions, and mistakes do not define who they are forever. People can change, but they may need help, time, and support to change. And part of our role as Catholics and as human beings is to support those in need, not only at their best moments, but sometimes at their worst. And we can do this while placing value on both the victim's life and the life of the person who committed the crime, and work to make reparations for the harm caused while ensuring accountability. In doing so, we show that no life is without value. Those who commit crimes owe it to themselves and to their victims to treat their life with purpose and to do better by not causing further harm to others. The Church remains a strong advocate for promoting peace and ending suffering for every person. And I look to the words of Pope Paul VI, who stated, "If you want peace, work for justice." To help achieve that mission, we work hard every day keeping those words in mind. As Secretary of the Department of Corrections, I will continue to draw from my faith to find the balance between mercy, accountability, and public safety. Thank you.
Professor Strang.
Thank you, Judge Donnelly and Professor Klingele, especially for including me, and thank all of you for joining in the discussion tonight. Although I feel quite welcome here, I also at some level speak as an outsider in this narrow sense. I am no longer a Catholic. I'm a lapsed or former Catholic. But Catholicism, as for many people, I suspect in my position, remains an important formative experience for me, shaping my worldview, my view of morality, ethics, and our obligations to one another. I am nonetheless not a Catholic, and I don't pretend to speak as a Catholic today. Indeed, if forced to, I probably would align myself pretty closely with the 19th century satirist Samuel Butler, who among many quotable things in a letter once quipped, "People in general are equally horrified at hearing the Christian religion doubted and at seeing it practiced." For myself and only for myself, I decided some years back to try to live, and I hope give, and then die without the comfort of ideas I think not true. Human dignity, though, is a concept that I do think true, and the Catholic Church, to its credit, has a great deal to say about human dignity and has for its 2,000 years, roughly, the 2 millennia of its existence. This is a conference or a colloquium dedicated primarily to a discussion of crime and punishment theory. Secretary Carr alluded to that in quoting the Catholic Bishops of the United States Conference from their 2000 statement. And punishment theory tends to, broadly speaking, try to balance the retributive with the reparative or the restorative, justice and order with mercy. And all of that necessarily grapples with human dignity. And yet, to my mind, as primarily a practitioner for most of my adult life, and only lately trying to get accustomed to the notion of people calling me professor, to my eye, punishment theory, whatever its specifics, cannot explain the facts of what we actually see in practice, in our courts, in our prisons, in the mechanism of criminal enforcement. Punishment theory, whatever its specifics, assumes, I think fundamentally, that crime gives rise to an obligation of the broader society through its sovereign or the governmental apparatus available to it. Crime gives rise to an obligation to punish, to serve public safety, in part through individual correction and in part through removing offenders from a position to cause harm to the broader public. Practically, to my eye, over the last 3+ decades, that's not actually how it works. To my eye, at least, crime as we define and detect it, and the detection of crime always has been related to some selection and the intensity of policing of particular communities. But crime, rather than giving rise to an obligation to punish, I think practically gives rise to opportunities for captivity and surveillance that then in turn feed ancillary industries and the people in the bureaucracies of government and private enterprises that make their livings in some way through our processes of captivity and surveillance. In this small panel, we've got at least 3 of us who fall into that category. We've got a judge, got a defense lawyer, and we've got a former law enforcement officer, a really good one, who served both in the state and federal system and currently is the head of the Wisconsin Department of Corrections. But I have seen very little, unfortunately, direct correlation between punishment and public safety, let alone any causal connection between punishment producing public safety. And certainly the captivity and surveillance that I'm describing, which I think more accurately describe the actual purposes or day-to-day work of the people imposing captivity and surveillance, certainly have no more connection to public safety. It seems to me that this sort of captivity, whether it's the 20,000 people in Wisconsin prisons tonight, and 3 times that number under surveillance through community supervision, or if we look at the entire 2.3 million people in the United States who tonight will go to bed behind bars, and the millions more who are on surveillance, often for years or even decades under court supervision. All of this, I think, is deeply inconsistent with Catholicism, as I understand it, lapsed Catholic that I am, and with Christianity were we to practice it. The Catholic conception of human dignity, like the Jewish conception, is rooted in, at bottom, rooted in the very first chapter of Genesis, which teaches that God made people in his image. The Catechism of the Catholic Church expands on that idea, explaining that alone among animals, humans, here I quote, share in God's own life. The Holy See repeatedly, through the 20th century, certainly, and into the 21st, has tied the idea of human dignity to crime, poverty, punishment, and the duties of political leaders and scholars with respect to all of those topics and more. A flood of Latin names could follow in citations here to the Catholic teaching in this respect under the auspices of the Holy See and in the various conferences of bishops. But for me, we simply don't lock up or watch with deep suspicion for years on end anyone in whom we recognize the image of God. We don't hold captive those who share in God's own life. We are perceiving people as something other than that necessarily to do what we do with them. I genuinely, I don't know about you, but I genuinely welcome approaches like the person first ethos that Secretary Carr describes and that we're beginning to see in spots around the country. I welcome it. But as a piece of punishment theory, I don't think it or any expansion of it, or indeed punishment theory itself, will get us to understanding why it is we've built the system of captivity and surveillance that we have, and why it is so resistant to change. So the Catholic tradition, Catholic thinkers have a great deal to contribute to this conversation. Discussing punishment theory is worthwhile and important. I also would consider, though, expanding that frame to address directly what we're doing which is felt as punishment by the people experiencing it, but not in the first instance intended directly as that. It is intended as surveillance and as captivity. That's the broader conversation I hope to have. Thank you.
Father Javier.
Thank you, Judge Donnelly, and thank you all for being here tonight in this panel discussion. Like Professor Strang, I think I too am an outsider. I'm not a lawyer, I'm not a judge, but I can offer tonight some reflections on Pope Francis's thought on this topic of crime and punishment, especially as he addresses judges, jurists, lawyers, and lawmakers. And I would like to begin by saying that the founding or the driving principle for Pope Francis is to put the person at the center, as we have heard from Secretary Carr and Professor Strang. And I'm sure we will hear also as well from Professor Klingele. And he has a principle called the pro homine principle, in favor of the person, in favor of man. And a second one, which he calls cautela in penam. Here are the Latin names that Professor Strang was talking about, which is caution in punishment. And it follows from that first principle in favor of the person. What we have to keep in mind is that we're not just talking about crime and punishment or a person who has committed a crime and what we need to do with that person in order to reestablish the asymmetry that has been committed with that person's crime, because that's our first instinct. There has been an asymmetry in a crime, and we have to reestablish that. Pope Francis is talking about taking care not only of that person, but also of the victim and also of the community. There are three, it's a triangle here, a trifecta that needs to be healed, a trifecta of relations, of relationships that needs healing. And I would like to refer to St. Paul's statement in his letter to the Romans, chapter 5, where he says, where sin abound, grace abound all the more. That there's always hope for redemption in these three parties that are involved in every single crime or in every transgression, according to these two principles. And so we take a look at the person who committed the crime. Pope Francis says that that person needs confession, contrition, and restitution. I am not a judge, I am not a lawyer, but I am edified by what Secretary Carr has stated. I have not worked in a prison, but as a pastor, as a priest, I'm always edified by anyone who walks into the confessional, because they are meeting themselves in the truth as God sees them. They acknowledge what they have done. And it is so liberating to see how happy they are when they come out. And what is most edifying is their contrition and their resolve to make restitution for whatever, whether it's a white lie or a heinous crime that they have committed. The reason why this is so powerful is because they acknowledge what they have done freely without making excuses, without hiding behind a sociological situation which may have driven them to commit such crime, or a family situation, which are all there, or a psychological state. But when a person says, I have done this, there is a freedom, there's a transcendence, actually. There's a moment of the person that is in act, right? And that act is really the greatest, one of the greatest instances of, or manifestations of how they are indeed created in the image and likeness of God. What they have freely done, they can also freely confess. And with the grace of God, where sin abounds, grace abounds all the more. They can receive forgiveness and consolation and really solace and understanding of who they are in a way that goes beyond what they have done, as we have heard by Secretary Carr and Professor Strang have said. But Pope Francis is not only concerned about redeeming this person who has committed the crime, but also taking care of the victim. And so he urges our lawmakers and our institutions to really develop an ethic of care for the victim. It's interesting how in the parable of the Good Samaritan that actually is there, taking care of the person who has fallen in with robbers, doesn't say, well, let me do you justice. Hold on a second here. I got to go chase the robber and I'll get back your belongings. And I'm sure that will make you very happy. No, it's not about that. Doing justice to the victim is taking care of the victim first, as he points out in his magisterium, in his teaching. Now, how do we take care of the victim? Well, just like with people who commit crimes, they are wounded but redeemable. So too the victim, we have to recognize, is also wounded by original sin, because that victim can fall into a mentality of revenge. And what we have to help, or the Pope urges us to do with the victim and taking care of the victim, is to help them not desire vengeance, because that's the way that the victim actually can hurt himself or herself even more. Yes, they have suffered, but they can suffer even more by simply desiring this kind of idealistic kind of justice, by falling into Hammurabi's law, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. That's justice. No, that's not justice. That's revenge, perhaps. And so the victim has to be helped to not fall into revenge, into vengeance. And actually, the suffering that they also incur, and here's from a Christian point of view, imitating Jesus, who suffered innocently for us, he's the only true innocent victim, that they can offer up vicariously, if you allow me that word, right? Offering that suffering for the person that has committed the crime against them, for their salvation, because ultimately that's the Christian point of view. Turn the other cheek, right? Love your enemies, right? Pray for those who persecute you. Forgive. This is very difficult if one has not experienced forgiveness himself or herself. But the fact is, the victim has to realize that we are we've been on the other side as well. We've offended as well. We're not totally innocent either. And we've gotten away with, quote, murder in many other things. And so we can always place ourselves outside of ourselves in the shoes of the person who has transgressed against us. And that exercise of actually going out of ourselves is basically what Jesus would ask of us in the gospel. Right? So there's the wounded nature of the victim, and the forgiveness, actually, that ethic of forgiveness, which is not easy to do, can actually go beyond and heal the victim. Even from a psychological point of view, I will let the psychiatrists and psychologists actually explain the benefits of forgiveness. And there's many of those studies actually out there. This is how Pope Francis takes care of the person first. Taking care of the person who has committed the crime, taking care of the victim, helping both actually come out of the woundedness of our human nature and actually going beyond. But there's the third party that is also wounded, and that is the community itself, which is represented by the institutions, our criminal justice system, and other institutions that are involved in crime. And here, I would say that these institutions need to, or the people actually that make up the institutions and our laws, we, like Judge Donnelly said at the beginning, quoting Pope Francis, we need to work towards a restorative justice system. And here I would say that the Holy Father has created a kind of controversy, right, with in saying that the death penalty is inadmissible. He has created this category of inadmissibility, and all Catholic theologians out there are saying, well, is it intrinsically evil or not? And there's this infinite debate about what about, past Catholic tradition on the death penalty. But the Pope is saying, let's not worry about whether it's intrinsically evil or not. Let's actually look at the fact that the most consistent position on being pro-life, right? Really being pro every life, pro every human being, is that we should have caution in punishment. Because when we punish in a way that takes away hope, then we are doing harm to ourselves as a community, right? And he always says a prison should have a window. Prison with a window is his way of saying that every kind of punishment should actually lead to redemption and hope for a transformation in that person who has committed the crime. And he actually also points out the hypocrisy in some institutions or in some systems of law or whatever, because they facilitate crime, white-collar crime that goes unpunished and actually does a lot more harm than the actual person who is, out on the street selling drugs or something like that. But it's the white-collar crime that promotes that. And here, Ted Bundy, who was executed, his last words, I believe, were, they asked him right before he was executed, well, do you have anything to say? He says, yes, I do. Actually, today I'm being executed, but what led me here was the pornography industry. And today you're executing me, but you're not doing anything about the pornography industry. Last words. What are we doing about the pornography industry? Another part of our community that actually promotes crime, promotes the disorder in our passions that then lead to further disorder in individuals, and other such institutions like that. The community is wounded, but can be redeemed. Those wounds in the community are not just the ones, committed by the people who actually are tried and sent to prison, but also the ones that don't fit the anthropology, right, of members that are created in the image and likeness of God. And this is why Pope Francis says these two principles are very important in our criminal justice system. Pro homine, pro person, putting the person first, and caution and punishment, just like Jesus before the adulterous woman. He's not worried about punishing the adulterous woman as much as actually making the people who are about to stone her examine their conscience and examine whether or not they need a conversion as well. And so he says to them, whoever is sinless, throw the first stone. And they all go away because they reflect on the fact that they too may have transgressed and that they too, need a conversion. And so in passing judgment, Pope Francis says to judges, be humble, because your judgment may be fallible. And in fact, human judgment is right. It's true. We can approach the truth, and certainly we can make a true judgment, but there's always an imperfection that we have to take into account because we don't know all the facts, and we're not judging the whole person. We have to judge the act, fine, and we have to keep the safety of the community, fine. But in the end, there's a very fine line, in the way, like Secretary Carr said, the way we use language, right? So a judge shouldn't say, you've acted like an animal, you've acted like, but this happens all the time. And we have to be careful to respect every single person involved in the sin, because grace abounds all the more. And that's what Jesus Christ has come to reveal to us. Thank you very much.
And to redeem the entire evening, Professor Klingele.
Thank you, Judge Donnelly, and thanks to all, particularly Father Javier, because I promise we didn't actually coordinate our talks, but you wouldn't know it. I have to get my computer to unlock, y'all. It has to read there. All right. As we've discussed a lot tonight already, problems abound in the ways that the American criminal legal system imposes punishment. And too often we're biased or even arbitrary in how we decide what to punish and when to punish and how much to punish. When we invoke prosecution and punishment instead of turning the other way, punishments aren't proportional to wrongdoing, whether we judge that by harm to individuals or by the moral culpability of those who are being sentenced. There are few pathways to reintegration following punishment, and punishment too often imposes lasting, even lifelong stigmas that petrify people, as we've discussed, with the label of criminal, and prevents other and truer aspects of their identities from developing and being acknowledged by the broader community. Those are just a couple of the problems our system faces. They are problems so significant that among both scholars and activists within the criminal legal community, increasingly we are seeing a change in the way we even discuss this system, away from reference to the criminal justice system and toward insistence on the phrase criminal legal system, a perhaps unintended play on words, that very consciously, however, rejects any suggestion that justice has a central role to play in what's happening here. Within Catholic thought and tradition, there is much that could, and I hope very much eventually will, be said about how we might bring justice back to the center of our formal state responses to the transgressions that we label criminal. Today, though, rather than highlighting aspects of Catholic thought, I want to highlight two interrelated practices that I think have perhaps more salience than any writing. One is the examen, which is sometimes called the examination of consciousness, and the other is the sacrament of reconciliation, also known as confession. As human beings, we like to tell stories, including stories about ourselves. Some of those are true, and some are not. The examen is a practice that is designed to help us to connect with the deeper and truer story of who we are and where we're going. It involves setting aside time, ideally every day, to reflect on what's happening in your life, your behavior, your heart. In examining one's day, or week, or life, as the case may be, the goal is not to produce a lengthy litany of sins and self-recriminations. Instead, it's meant to reveal the deepest desires of one's heart and the circumstances, the choices, the people, and the other contexts that move us closer to or further away from the realization of those desires. Over time, if practiced regularly and bravely, it can lead to true humility, which is, in our tradition, a grounded knowledge of who we are and where we need to grow. The second practice, the sacrament of reconciliation, is for Catholics an opportunity to bring before God and the Church, both who are represented in the person of the priest, those parts of our life in which we need growth and healing and change. In that sacrament, we do three things, which Father Javier just nicely told us. First, we take responsibility for what we have done and for what we have failed to do, what has harmed others, ourselves, and the world around us. Second, we firmly resolve to change with the help of grace. And third, we agree to make reparations to those we have harmed, including ourselves, through completion of whatever form of penance is imposed on us by the priest. And since the goal of the sacrament is to celebrate our repentance, as you heard, rather than punish our past transgressions, this part usually isn't too onerous. The priest then speaks the words of absolution in the words of the prayer, granting us pardon and peace and absolving us from our sins. Through this practice, we believe we are freed from the burden of sin and reintegrated fully into the life of the community. It's kind of cool. So what do these two practices have to do with criminal justice reform? The most obvious and expected, I imagine, analogy would be to the theater of the plea hearing, in which the defendant in a criminal matter concedes guilt on each element of the offense that constitutes his crime, or at least agrees not to contest it. And the sentencing judge, acting in the name of the civil community, then imposes a punishment designed to signal the wrongfulness of the criminal transgression and serve in some way, though the mechanisms, as Dean suggested here, aren't really clear, as a remedy for harm done to crime victims and to the larger community. But, true story, I don't actually think that's a good analogy at all. The beauty of the examen and the repentance to which it leads, expressed fully in the healing of the sacrament of reconciliation, is that, as Father Javier mentioned, it's rooted in human freedom, in the desire to vulnerably and honestly put right something we know is dissonant in our lives. Some defendants, of course, do feel genuine remorse for their criminal behavior, and they want the forgiveness of those they've harmed. In addition, some accept that some kind of sanction is a just response to their misbehavior. But far more often, I think, Dean is right. Criminal defendants are rushed through the morality play of the courtroom, playing at something they believe is untrue and unjust, not out of true repentance, but because of the relentless pressures of a criminal legal system that doesn't have time to consider the context in which crime occurs, or the ways in which we have all created environments that enable our brothers and sisters to yield to temptation and to act in ways we label criminal. That is a system that does not make space for the full truth. So if the examine and reconciliation don't represent good models for repentance by people who commit crime, why am I talking about them? Well, it seems to me that people interested in improving the criminal justice system would do well to spend a lot less time thinking about the transgressions of people who are prosecuted for crime, and a lot more time thinking about the transgressions committed by the system itself and those who shape and operated it, many of us in this room included. On a personal level, it's pretty easy to see how this would work. Imagine for a moment if every police officer, prosecutor, defense attorney, judge, and correctional officer, not to mention every legislator, took time each day to reflect on the ways in which his or her exercise of power or discretion either advanced the integrity and fairness of the people affected by those choices or detracted from it. Imagine, too, that rather than stopping at shallow self-recrimination, those state actors considered the context in which they felt empowered to make decisions that advanced justice, and on the context in which they felt constrained in their ability to do so. Over time, I think our courtrooms and jails and encounters with police would look and feel a lot different than they do today. But I don't think it strains the analogy too far to also suggest that there are ways to move from examination of the individual to examination of the institutional. Pope John Paul II wrote about the structures of sin that dominate relationships between individuals and peoples. Although for Catholics, sin is ultimately personal, individual sins can lead over time to the development of systems that place goods in the hands of the few at the expense of the just needs of the many, allowing the consequences of personal sin, in the Pope's words, to introduce into the world influences and obstacles which go far beyond the actions and brief lifespan of any one individual. Many of the most troubling aspects of the American criminal legal system, including, and perhaps especially, persistent racial and economic disparities among those punished, as well as the harsh and long-lasting collateral effects of punishment on children and families of those prosecuted, and on those who have completed their court-imposed sentences entirely, seem well characterized to me as structures of sin that invite us, again, in the words of Pope John Paul II, to commit to the good of our neighbor with the readiness, in the gospel sense, to lose ourselves for the sake of the other instead of exploiting him, and to serve him instead of oppressing him for our own advantage. Dismantling these structures of sin requires institutions to commit to genuine self-reflection on the roles they and their predecessors have played in causing harm and not just in responding to it. It would require honesty, repentance, a firm resolution to make meaningful change, and a willingness to make reparation not on terms they dictate for themselves, but on terms imposed by the communities to which they seek to be reconciled. That's a tall order for individuals. It's an almost unheard of endeavor for institutions. And yet, that's the path to reconciliation. So what might that mean in practical terms? I'm a professor, so I don't really have to answer that question, but I have a couple of ideas. I think it begins by inculcating the value of reflection in those working throughout the system, whether in police precincts or courtrooms or prisons. It means modeling non-punitive responses to errors when people admit to making them, for inviting critical observations and suggestions for change. It also, and perhaps this is the hardest in our highly politicized criminal legal system, It also means having the moral courage to push back against the predictable backlash that occurs anytime any actor in the criminal justice system concedes error to the public or to the press. These interventions can begin very simply. I had the joy almost a decade ago of working with a small juvenile probation agency. So they supervise children who are on probation. And we were talking about what it would look like to engage in culture change in that agency. And just in talking informally with several of the supervisors in that office, it very quickly became clear that there were a number of things that they were doing in that office that gave them moral pause. They thought it was uncomfortable, maybe even unfair, some of the things that they were doing to children and families. And we talked about it for a while. And as lawyers do, I asked questions like, have you talked about that before? Well, what do you think you could do differently? Who would you have to involve to do that? Right? And it didn't take long for them to generate all kinds of creative responses. I'd also point out it didn't cost any money at all. We were just talking. And later, when talking to the director of that agency, I said, what if you had lunch once a week, once a month? I don't know. And you said, what's bothering you about what we're doing here? They did that for a while, and I think it made some really big changes. Changes in the way that they treated the people who were in their care, changes in the way they treated the families of those people, and changes in how they thought about themselves and the job they were being asked to do every day. It made them feel not like widgets who are just enforcing rules, but as moral agents making decisions that had consequence for their communities and for the people that they served. Until our criminal justice institutions acknowledge their role in creating and perpetuating many of the injustices in today's system, we are unlikely to see true and lasting reform. Much like individuals, institutions are unlikely to be perfected in one fell swoop through one single act of repentance. Instead, they are likely, like people, to return again and again and again to an awareness and an acknowledgement of the ways that they've failed, to re-resolve, to do better, and to commit to the work of making right those things that are broken. Regardless how ambitious or modest their initial efforts may be, I think we could imagine a system that would change dramatically and for the better. And I hope that that's something we'll try. Thank you very much.
We have time for just some brief questions, and I see Father O'Meara from Marquette University. Do you have a question? And if you could approach the microphone.
Years of training with the bullshit. Okay.
And maybe hold the microphone up because it's a little low there. Can get it out of its stand there.
Maybe.
It just comes out like this.
Voila. All right. We've talked a lot about human dignity. It's been a theme that's come through. And also civil society, and a linkage that Catholic social thought makes is that the only reason for civil society, the only reason for civil institutions is to uphold human dignity. Is there a way we could sell that and make sense of that, living as we do in the society we're in? What thinkest thou? Anybody?
Professor Klingele?
So you mean, can we sell society an idea that human
And do you have your mic on there?
She does.
All right.
Yes. Oh. I'll do what I do in the classroom, just hold this. You mean, how do we sell people on the idea that human dignity is the center?
That's the only reason we have civil society for watching the terrorists and a few other pieces. This is the only service.
Yes, and flourishing, right? That we're going to acknowledge that people are made in the image and likeness of God, and then provide them with the capacity or the opportunity to realize their God-given capacity, right, to become who they're meant to be, right, which will always be focused on opportunities to affirm dignity, right? And that in the particular takes lots of different forms, right? Everything from providing people with opportunities for meaningful work, for involvement in the betterment of their own communities. There are infinite permutations of the ways that human beings can flourish, right? And develop their creative capacity. I think that, how do we sell it? The truth sells itself if spoken clearly, is my sense that it resonates. Like one of the beautiful things I think that even today's conversations have made clear is that the idea that the human person is worthy of greater respect, certainly, than the person receives in most contexts, resonates well across religious lines, right? Whether you are a person of faith or not, whether you share in the Judeo-Christian tradition or not, we are fundamentally all human, right? And have that shared experience and knowledge of self, which gives rise to a sense of the dignity of the other too. And I think the problem is we get distracted, and we get distracted by all of the other things we could focus on instead of always returning to that center. And I do think America is particularly challenged in this way because all people are challenged, right, in realizing human dignity. It doesn't matter where or when you live. However, our legal systems don't really acknowledge dignity, for example, as a legal concept in the same way you see in many European nations, for example, where dignity is a legal principle. And we don't share that in our American tradition. And I think it's a loss for us. And certainly in the criminal justice system, we see it.
Thank you. And we have time for one last question. Professor Pope? Coming all the way from Boston, he has to have a good question.
Thank you. I think you guys are a great panel. There's a lot of coherence between your positions. I want to follow up on that question though, because it seems to me cable television, AM radio, and social media are convincing people that the ones who have dignity are people that think like them, and that outsiders are a threat, even though they might be the next door neighbor. The division is a major corrosive factor in trying to have a consensus about human dignity. I think each one of you is pointing out important values that are threatened by the meanness and the hostility and the dehumanization that the social media and mass media are fomenting right now. People are making money off it. I don't think anything happens like that on that scale without people making money. What can be done?
Father Javier?
Thank you, Professor. And also thank you, Father, for your question. I would just like to point out that on this issue of human dignity, that if it's not founded on God, then it is going to be a variable that is going to be manipulated, right? And actually I would point to an article by Marianne Glendon on this, where she talks about how right after World War II, in the document that the United Nations drafted, whatever it was called, the
Declaration of Human Rights.
of Human Rights, that they explicitly did not put God in it, and they debated that. And they decided to put the word dignity instead. and as the ultimate foundation. And she says, that's good because they still had the corpses of Auschwitz, right, and the concentration camps fresh in their minds. So they had kind of an absolute agreement as to what human dignity entailed. But as time went on, if you don't ground it on God, on something transcendent that doesn't change, then what happens is that you manipulate the meaning of the word for your purposes. So it is not dignified for a woman to give birth under certain conditions. It is not dignified for someone to die, in a hospital alone, and it's better that they choose to die whenever they want to die and however they want to die, with assisted suicide or whatever. So dignity now becomes really the tool of social media or whatever it is. And like you said, Professor, they tell you what is dignified, what it means to be a human being, what it means to have dignity. And one of my personal concerns right now is that we have a collective identity crisis. What does it mean to be human right now? And a growing, I would say, voluntarism in the fact that it is now up to us to create our own identity, whether it's in our avatar, we could be whatever we want, whatever gender we want, whatever, however we want to be and appear to the world. That's how we are pressured to create our own identity, who we are, right? And why? Because we fear that we won't be accepted, because we don't have dignity, because we don't know who we are. Because I think we have forgotten that very principle, that we are made in the image and likeness of God, that we have been loved first, and that it is this that is now being manipulated.
And on that note of love, we must end our conversation. I want to, I'm sorry, we're a little bit over time, and I apologize for that. I want to thank especially Professor Klingele, who has not only marshaled this night, but the gathering of scholars that is going to follow from this evening. And also to mention Thomas Levergood, late founder of the Lumen Christi Institute, whose vision it was to create the Catholic Criminal Justice Reform Network. And it has been a very powerful impetus, gathering 120 network members, practitioners, scholars, those impacted by the court system, either as those harmed or those who are offenders, and gathering, as we will, in a major conference in April at Georgetown. This was Thomas Levergood's vision and comes from the Lumen Christi Institute, which seeks to bring the Catholic tradition and the intellectual things that it has to offer to the secular world. But I'm going to close again on the note of love with a quote that Father Javier loves from the novel Resurrection by Leo Tolstoy. The reason this has happened is because these people, governors, superintendents, police officers, patrolmen, think there can be situations in this world in which loving consideration for humanity is not obligatory. And with that, I'd like you to join me in thanking our wonderful panel and wish you a good night.